The American Revolution is my favorite war because I like George Washington, wigs, the hairpiece, Native American history and their role in the colonies, struggle for independence, and the birth of the United States. One of the few films from the Golden Age about colonial America is Drums Along the Mohawk, a historical drama directed by John Ford set in New York's Mohawk Valley during the Revolutionary War. It's surprising how few classic films there are from this time period, especially since in the 1930s and early 40s there's definitely a trend of like Civil War or turn of the century films set in the American South. Jezebel, Little Foxes, and of course Gone with the Wind. I do feel like since Hamilton came out, people are maybe more interested in colonial history, which is great, even though for the rest of time kids growing up will probably imagine Alexander Hamilton as like a 5'1" Puerto Rican. Drums Along the Mohawk stars Henry Fonda and Claudette Colbert as Gil and Lana Martin. Both actors were pretty old by Hollywood standards when they made this film, aka my age. It was released in 1939, which is often regarded as the golden year of the golden age because so many films that are classics were released this year. Gone with the Wind, obviously, The Wizard of Oz, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, my favorite Sherlock Holmes, The Hounds of Baskerville. Even for John Ford, 1939 was an extraordinary year because he made Stagecoach that year, and Young Mr. Lincoln, which also starred Henry Fonda. Drums Along the Mohawk is, of course, adapted from the 1936 novel by Walter D. Edmonds because it's the 1930s and people still read things other than tarot cards. The plot is based on historical events, but what I really appreciate about it is that it captures the spirit of the colonies on the eve of revolution. It isn't entirely accurate and very much weaves the John Ford myth of America. It's essentially a Western set on the frontier of New York rather than the plains, but I go to Disneyland all the time, so I'm fine with fantasy. I don't really care about accuracy in my art. Gil and Lana Martin settle in the Mohawk Valley, which is part of the Hudson River Valley. It's occupied by German and Dutch immigrants and, of course, the Iroquois Nation. As the American Revolution approaches, the locals form a militia to ward off the Tories and Native American tribes loyal to the English crown. The Martins' farm is burned to the ground. Destitute, the Martins are forced to work as hired help for the spunky and salt of the earth widow McKenna, played by Edna May Oliver. When British forces approach, the local militia meets them in the Battle of Oriskany. Later, the British attack in an attempt to take the valley. The settlers flee to Fort Schuyler, which, if you've seen the musical Hamilton, you probably recognize that surname. When they can no longer hold the fort, Gil runs through enemy territory to get assistance from neighboring Fort Dayton. Cornwallis soon surrenders to Washington and a new nation is born and peace is restored in the valley. There are lots of other fun Hollywood elements, including an awesome autumn harvest festival scene where there's jack-o'-lanterns and line dancing and Mexicans playing Native Americans. Drums Along the Mohawk is fiction, however there are some real historic figures and battles mentioned. It's loosely based on the battles of the Saratoga Campaign, where the British made their way down from Quebec in an attempt to secure the Hudson River Valley. Basically, the New England colonies were a patriot hotbed. Knowing that, the British attempted to isolate those states and infiltrate New York, especially in the Hudson River Valley, where colonists were more neutral and could be more easily swayed and manipulated. As the name suggests, the Mohawk Valley is home to the Iroquois Nation, who ended up divided during the war. So some tribes sided with the colonists and some sided with England. All of the Iroquois were concerned about the growing number of white settlers in the region. This is like the Highland Park of the colonies, and the tribes tried to stay neutral until the war encroached on them, and then they just had to pick a side. And they did so according to who they thought would uphold their interests best. The settlers in the Mohawk Valley were essentially German refugees. Many had been forced out of the German region of Palatine and took refuge in England or in the colonies to start a new life. The Iroquois took pity on them and allowed them to settle in the Mohawk River Valley. The relationship between the Palatines and the Iroquois was very hospitable compared to the British relations in Ohio and Pennsylvania. They helped each other with agriculture, trade, and negotiated land deals. Between 1756 and 1774, on the New York frontier, only 5 colonists were killed by Native Americans, while just 6 Native Americans were killed by settlers. That's only 11 casualties in almost 20 years. That's like pretty good for colonial times. More people die at Coachella than that every year. Occupied almost solely by Germans, and there was very little genocide, so let that sink in. Just like the Iroquois Confederacy was attempting to stay out of the Revolutionary War, in 1939 the U.S. was trying to stay out of World War II. And just like the Iroquois, America joined the war when the war came to our home front. One of the biggest historical inaccuracies in Drums Along the Mohawk was influenced by these current events. In the film, all of the enemy are the Iroquois. In reality, even though the Loyalists and the Native Americans did play a part, the biggest threat to the colonists would have been the actual British Army. However, since Britain was already at war with Nazi Germany, John Ford didn't want to demonize the British and defaulted to the good old-fashioned Hollywood bad guy, Indians. There is only one Tory character, Caldwell, played by John Carradine, and he skulks around in an eye patch and cape, and it's so cool it makes you want to side with the crown. It's really hard to sympathize with these dirty, toothless colonists when there's a fabulous, probably homosexual Chassain about the valley. A couple very cool facts about the cast. The only person nominated for this film was Edna May Oliver. Oliver came from a long-standing Boston family and was a direct descendant of President John Adams through his son, President John Quincy Adams. Henry Fonda also has colonial heritage, ironically in the Mohawk River Valley. He's the great-great-grandson of 17th century Dutch immigrant Douw Fonda, who founded the town of Fonda, New York, in the Hudson River Valley. He was too old to serve in the Revolutionary War, but he was killed and scalped by British supporting Mohawk. Most of the movie was filmed in Cedar City, Utah, rather than upstate New York. There were a lot of weather delays, and the entire battle scene of Oriskany that was supposed to take place over 3 weeks had to be completely cut. It was replaced with a monologue by Henry Fonda describing the battle, which was completely improvised. It was actually a conversation between Ford and Fonda where Ford would ask him questions, and then the questions were edited out in the final shot, and it looked like a long speech. Along the Mohawk is John Ford's first colorized film. In my opinion, it's largely overlooked because of its close proximity to Stagecoach. Also just not as strong of a film, even though I personally love it because I love the 18th century. But I think maybe this film has the potential to be remade today. I don't think it's one of those movie classics that shouldn't be touched. I would be interested in seeing a modern adaptation of the story, especially delving deeper into the history of the region, colonists, Native American relations. Let me know what you think in the comments if you've seen this movie.